Hello, my name is Jane Renyk, and welcome to my presentation on a time management intervention to help combat the perception of academic stress and anxiety in high school students. I'll be breaking down the content into 3 sections. Section 1, what I did. Here I'll be discussing the details of the intervention. Section 2, effectiveness. In this section, I'll be going over the data gathered from pre- and post surveys and discussing observations and conclusions. Finally, in Section 3, the reflection, I'll discuss how the intervention went in practice and what I would keep and do differently next time. What I did. Student level. The intervention participants were all volunteers consisting of a group of 16 students total, 7 students from Centennial and 9 students from Central Memorial. 6 students have diagnosed learning disabilities, and all students completed this intervention while in their visual arts class, but the intervention itself is not subject specific. The ultimate goal would be to transition this intervention to be used across multiple classes with the possibility of it being built into homeroom programs. The intervention consisted of 7 grade 12 students from Centennial and 9 grade 10 students from Central. Finally, it was run as a Tier 2 intervention, working with smaller groups. However, in the future, this program could be run as a Tier 1 program with every student in the class. So, what were the challenges that inspired me choosing this type of intervention? It was actually inspired by 2 unrelated students I taught last year who were really struggling with anxiety. They came to me for help because it was nearing the end of the semester and they were feeling overwhelmed with the course load of all of their classes piling up. One student had a pretty significant learning disability and was at risk of failing one of their classes and consequently not graduating. The other, a high achiever who was trying to win scholarships and gain entrance into her first choice for post-secondary. Long story short, what became clear over the course of meeting with these students was the power of how creating a simple to-do list and chunking larger assignments and tasks would result in them leaving our meetings slightly more confident and reassured that they could accomplish their assignments. So with regards to anxiety, what's going on in the brain? Let's discuss. First of all, it's important to note that symptoms of mood and anxiety disorders are thought to result in part from disruption in the balance of activity in the emotional centers of the brain, rather than in the higher cognitive centers. And at the heart of our emotional brain is our amygdala. Whether it's via the thalamus, which is the hub of the brain for interpreting the senses of sight and sound and sending signals to the appropriate parts of the cortex, or the angular gyrus, vernix area, insular cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, all working together to interpret language, if fear is detected, the amygdala is going to be triggered. The thalamus relays messages to the cortex that then decides whether or not a fear response is required. If a fear response is deemed necessary, signals are sent to the amygdala. The amygdala is a neural hub known to process fearful and threatening stimuli and to then engage a sequence of reactions in response. Airways in the lungs open wider, allowing for more air to enter with every breath, increasing the amount of oxygen to the brain, which in turn increases our ability to be more alert. All senses become sharper as a defense mechanism. Additionally, that release of epinephrine also triggers an increase in glucose, or blood sugar, and fats from temporary storage sites in the body, which flood the bloodstream, giving us more energy to combat whatever threat the brain is perceiving. The feeling those 2 students felt of being overwhelmed and anxious, in my personal opinion, somewhat stems from a lack of ability to manage time and workload. I know I'm guilty sometimes of forgetting that these kids have 3 other classes typically in their day besides mine, consisting of other teachers giving them homework and deadlines. Add on to that planning fallacy, our inability to estimate how long a task will take. Unless we are experienced in completing a task already, we tend to have limited knowledge of how long something will take us to do. Planning fallacy is a term used to describe our inability to estimate how long it will take, considering the age of our students, and that many times we are asking them to do an assignment or test on topics for the first time, they will have limited knowledge of how long it will take them to do it. Additionally, we have so many distractions around us, particularly with regards to our phones. When left to work independently, do our students have the capacity to get the work done while managing the distractions around them? Okay, so what's happening in our brain with regards to the management of time? Let's discuss. One of the biggest tools in being able to manage our time is our working memory. And as we've all experienced at some point, when someone adds that one last thing onto our to do list, that's enough to trigger our working memory into feeling completely overwhelmed. Since its formal introduction into the world of psychology and neuroscience 50 years ago, the general consensus on working memory is that it is extensively involved in goal directed behaviors in which information must be retained and manipulated to ensure successful task execution. That sounds great, but interestingly, our brains are actually wired to make using that working memory for time management more difficult than it should be. Present bias, also known as hyperbolic discounting, is the tendency to choose smaller rewards now over larger rewards that are more distant in time. The ventral striatum is sensitive to the availability and gain of a reward, and the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial orbital frontal cortex respond to both the presence and the gain of immediate reward. Our brain's tendency towards bias makes sitting down and mapping out tasks and then working on them when we don't want to quite difficult. And with a cell phone sitting next to us just taunting us with tiny little rewards, almost impossible. I had no idea there would be such a lack of intervention material for this topic when I started off on this assignment. So I had to create my own. But I based it on 3 studies done by researchers interested in the same issues I was. Each of the studies listed here conducted a pre and post test survey, specifically the abbreviated time management survey created originally in 2001, and they each implemented 2 to 6 homework assignments. Study number 1 was good, but the language and context in the surveys used were a little too young for high school students. Study number 2 was the one I pulled most content from. The language used was a little more age appropriate, and the homework assignments were interesting and relevant. Additionally, they also surveyed anxiety and depression in their students. I didn't end up using their survey, though, they did, because I felt it was a little too heavy in content, dealing with issues of suicide and emotional distress. Seeing as how the students in my intervention were not my own, and that I was asking my friends to use their students, I didn't want to go into that area of psychological distress without knowing the necessary supports would be there. So I instead used a different survey for anxiety. Study number 3 was also good in that it elaborated a little bit more on tinkering with the number of homework assignments and duration of the intervention. All in all, however, each study concluded that there actually wasn't much improvement overall in the time management skills of the students. So I decided to take some elements of their homework assignments that I thought were applicable to my intervention, but also went off on my own and created 2 different ones. As I mentioned before, the pre and post surveys were the abbreviated time management survey. It has been used and referenced in tons more than just the 3 studies I've covered here, but it's actually unpublished on the internet. So I reached out to one of the creators, Dr. Richard D. Roberts, and he graciously sent it my way, but warned me that the content was a bit dated now, seeing as how it was created in 2001. So I adjusted a bit of the language and added some questions referencing things like digital file organization, but overall, I actually felt it held up pretty well. The survey has 6 categories. I've kept them separate here for the presentation, but in the actual practice, all of the questions were randomly organized into one survey without categories when the students completed it. Category A, having a workspace. Category B, meeting deadlines. Category C, organizing time and tasks. Category D, planning ahead. Category E, setting goals. And finally, category F, staying focused. Any questions that had an asterisk next to them were actually reverse keyed in the data entry process. Despite testing the students on all 6 categories, I chose to focus my homework assignment design primarily on categories B, C, and D. I also surveyed the students using an excerpt from the self-efficacy beliefs of adolescents, as they did in studies number 2 and 3. The questions were interesting to go over, but in the end, I didn't end up using the information with regards to my overall conclusions on effectiveness, as they didn't entirely pertain to my end goals. As mentioned before, because I wasn't doing this intervention in person with my own students, I kept the anxiety measure strictly regarding academics. I used Bedway's Perception of Academic Stress Scale, released in 2015. The scale covers a few different topics, ranging from pressures of time to pressures of the future. And for my intervention data and goal collection, I chose to focus my goals on seeing improved scores in 4 specific questions. Am I confident that I will be a successful student? The time allocated to classes and academic work is enough. I have enough time to relax after work. And I fear failing courses this year. The homework assignment number 1 was to take the template I provided the students and add any deadlines for assignments and scheduled extracurricular activities. This was just to set a foundation for managing one's time and providing a visual for what else was going on in their lives. I really feel like homework assignment number 2, the chunking assignment, was where real learning could take place. It was to break down a larger project or assignment into smaller mini tasks by envisioning how you would go about creating this assignment, then identify how long each mini task will take. The student would then add them to the calendar. This is hopefully to also address the idea of that planning fallacy, to really draw attention to how long a specific mini task would take. I think assignment number 3 was actually where I started to lose some students, because here's where we started to play with like routine and having to do this every night. So every night for 7 nights, the student was to take 5 minutes to write down a to-do list for the following day. At the end of the next day, they would review their list, check off the things that they got done, and then move the ones that they didn't get done to that list or that new list. This was to demonstrate that by listing your to-dos the night before, it could impact your sleep and your anxiety levels in a positive way, and you weren't missing little things. Assignment number 4 definitely got some mixed feedback before it was even given out, before students even took it on, because it deals with cell phones. So part 1, for a 3-day period, each day the student needed to give their phone to someone they trusted for about 30 minutes while they did an academic activity like homework, worked on an assignment in class. So my friend did say that a lot of her students got her to take away their phone for half an hour during class while they did an art assignment. Then part 2, before bed, they were not supposed to engage with their phone for about 15 minutes before their head hit the pillow. So you go and you plug your phone in for 15 minutes before your bedtime, and you don't check it. You just go to sleep and you wake up the next morning. This was by far the hardest one to get students to buy into. It was admittedly mostly an experiment, but designed based on the notion that no phones before bed or during a time when focusing is needed can help stay on task and create positive sleep habits. It was geared towards that idea of present bias as a concept, as well as positive sleep. Baseline surveys were given out around Friday, May 12th, and the students were allowed the weekend to complete them. The first 2 homework assignments were given out the following week on the 17th, which meant that the first progress report came shortly after on the 23rd, along with homework number 3. A week later, the second progress report was done, along with homework number 4. Finally, a week after that, the final homework, the post-test survey was completed. Logistics. When? Because these were not my students, I was wary of asking my friends to use up their valuable time to accommodate this research project, especially at the end of the year. As a result, students were given a window of time to complete each step with an encouraged deadline as per the previous calendar. The students were asked to do all surveys and homework assignments on their own time, which meant usually from home. Progress monitoring was done at school. The who behind this intervention were 2 of my friends and colleagues who teach visual arts at Central Memorial High School and Centennial High School. Because the assignments and surveys were all being done by the students at home, unsupervised, it could be argued there is a loss of fidelity. Students could lie on their homework sheets and on the surveys, skewing the results. Additionally, because I'm on maternity leave, I was not the one issuing the surveys and homework to the students and cannot guarantee they were being given out on the schedule that I had outlined. Now that the process is done, it is even more clear that the fact that students could bring the assignments home is an issue. Many assignments were not handed in, but students said they had completed them, creating a situation where their results just simply can't be trusted without seeing the assignments themselves. For my progress monitoring, I chose to do an item analysis where I tried to find areas that were particularly low scoring on the pre-test survey average, and that I was specifically focusing my homework assignments on and pulled questions from there. I pulled 7 questions from the time management survey. These questions were specifically standouts because they scored exceptionally low compared to all of the other questions. Same thing went for the self-efficacy scales. I pulled 3 that were the lowest. One standout that kind of surprised me was the I live up to what I expect of myself. This continuously showed to score quite low through the entire exercise. With regards to the academic stress scale, again, I just pulled 8 questions that I ended up using for the progress monitoring because, again, they scored quite low in comparison to the other ones. One thing I will mention, though, in terms of the progress, the academic stress scale was the one that showed the greatest diversity in responses. Some scoring low, some scoring high. There was little predictability, which led me to believe that it could have had something to do with the time of year. So, was the intervention effective? Before discussing results and effectiveness, I think it's important to outline which students actually completed the entire intervention and which students didn't. Because homework assignments 1 and 2 were the key assignments pertaining to time management, I took every student who completed just those 2 assignments and nothing else and grouped them together. Then I created a second group of only the 4 students who completed the entire intervention. We'll call Group A the Homework 1 and 2 group, consisting of students 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, and 16. Group B is the completed absolutely everything and handed it in group. They are students 8, 10, 11, and 12. So what were my goals? What did I hope would happen? And did I achieve them? First, let's take a look at the time management survey results pre and post. As a reminder, the categories were having a workspace, category A, B is meeting deadlines, C, organizing time and tasks, D, planning ahead, E, setting goals, and F, staying focused. Each survey question was out of 4 points. The higher the score, the better, with some questions having to be reverse keyed. I did all of my scoring based on categories for data collection for my pre and post for time management. As I mentioned earlier, I mainly focused on categories B, C, and D because the scores were the lowest and the homework assignments were geared mainly towards those categories. So the numbers you see here are the average response score for the questions added up in that category. I definitely learned I created pretty lofty goals through this process. For categories B, C, and D, I was hoping for students to score themselves 1 point higher on 2 of the questions in each category rather than just 1. In this graph, the teal columns are the final survey results, and the red columns are the target goal. If the goal was met, the teal column should be higher than the red. Unfortunately, no goals were met. However, if the goal was simply to see improvements overall of any scale, there was growth in every category except for category B, meeting deadlines, and E, setting goals. Starting with Group B, you can see their baseline scores were totally comparable to Group A, just a slightly lower average. Again, the same goals were set. I just adjusted the numbers here to reflect only the students in Group B, so that just kind of alters the numbers a little bit. And similar to Group A, no targets were met. What is interesting, though, is there was growth in every category, similar to Group A. Different from Group A, though, is that Group B didn't actually drop in any category. They, in fact, either grew or stayed the same for meeting deadlines and C, planning ahead. So, drawing conclusions for Part 1, time management, was it effective? Because there were growth in some categories, one could argue that by simply drawing attention to some time management techniques, some students did learn something and apply it. However, the growth was not a significant amount to be conclusive. Why the no growth by Group A in meeting deadlines and setting goals? Hard to say, but I can't help but find it interesting that the group that struggled with meeting deadlines was also the group who didn't complete the entire intervention. Could it be that it was just too late in the year to make a difference? Similarly, the no decrease in Group B is an interesting data point, considering they were the small group who persevered and saw the entire intervention all the way through. The second half of the analysis is the data from the perception of academic stress surveys. I looked at the survey as a whole, but also took 4 specific questions as a focus because they were related to the homework design, as I mentioned earlier. The first data I pulled was taking a percentage score of the entire survey. Now remember, the lower the score, the better. The higher the score equals a higher stress level. Each question was scored out of 4. Group A saw a drop in the overall score, so that would be good, but not quite to the extent of my goal, which was based on a decrease in score of 1 point per student in 2 of the 4 focus questions. When analyzing the data of the 4 specific questions, there was actually an overall drop in the average responses in 3 out of the 4 questions. So all of them except for question 5, which is I have enough time to relax after work. In this case, the red column, which is the goal, represents what would have resulted if each student dropped their score by 1 point in that question. Unfortunately, is not met, but dropping scores in 3 out of the 4 questions on average is still worth noting. By this point in my data analysis, I started to kind of just assume that Group B would be similar to Group A with maybe a minor tweak here and there. However, Group B, interestingly and unfortunately, saw an increase in their overall average final scores, different from Group A, meaning an increase in perceived academic stress. When looking at the individual questions themselves, they only saw a drop in question 1. I am confident I will be a successful student. The other questions, they saw an increase in stress. Except for question 4, which just basically stayed the same. The time allocated to classes and academic work is enough. So looking at the intervention from the academic stress perspective, in conclusion, was it effective? It could be argued that Group A did see a slight decrease in stress, but oddly enough, they were the group not to complete all 4 homework assignments. Their incompletion rate also could explain their inability to finish the intervention as a whole. So possibly, it could be said that the homework assignments draw attention to skills that the students agree they need to grow and work on, but could possibly actually be adding more work to their plates or not providing enough support on managing the workload. In drawing awareness, I think it was successful. But in lowering overall stress levels to a large enough degree, I really don't think it was. The results were too unpredictable, and factoring in final exams, graduation, students were allowed to not come to school once they had finished their final projects in some classes, etc. I think the situation was just largely too much out of our control to draw any significant conclusions. Lastly, reflection. So what worked? Well, I can honestly say it was a relevant topic. Students seemed genuinely interested in the topic and they wanted to grow and learn more about it. They were very open-minded originally to try it. Secondly, I do think homework projects 1 and 2 were strong. Having students create a calendar and then chunk a larger assignment into smaller sections was really effective, according to the feedback that I got. This really addresses the lack of experience in understanding how long something takes. And finally, some of the questions. Some of the questions were great in giving really interesting feedback, and some students used the surveys to communicate even more info to me than I was asking for. For example, it became quite comical to see some students really circle certain responses with emphasis to try to draw attention to that question. Or they would write me little notes in the margins trying to contextualize their responses. The questions were really good. What didn't work? Obviously, not being in person. This was the biggest one. Clearly, being on maternity leave was hard. Not being there in person made it difficult to motivate students and also to gauge where they were at informally on a daily basis, just outside of the progress reporting. Also, the time of year. This intervention is designed to be done at the start of a semester when students don't have the same level of stress as they would at the end of a year. With grad, long weekends, and general end of year business, it was a lot to ask of students and teachers to take on. Quite a few students didn't see it through to the end. And lastly, I think it could have been too tough too fast. Not surprisingly, the intervention asked a lot of the students in terms of cutting out cell phone use. With more time, I'd ease them into that a little. I think I lost some of their commitment when the cell phone assignments came into play. I think because I have such a long list of what I would do differently, it was a successful intervention because I'm now motivated and keen to keep going. First of all, though, I would go digital. The surveys were distributed on paper, and although it was easy to do, the data could be handled better, I think, if they were completed digitally. And this was brought up in a discussion post earlier on in the assignment by a peer. I could have edited the questions more last minute if they had been done digitally too, because there were some minor errors in spelling and grammar. Secondly, and this was also brought up in one of our discussion posts, was the teacher provided data. So I would ask for teacher input in the form of surveys to create a baseline for each student on their perspective of their time management skills, as well as their perceived academic stress. I would also shorten the surveys. Simply put, they were just too long. I would use fewer questions and eliminate redundancy. Instead, I would structure the questions to be more scenario-based and descriptive. Due to the condensed time frame for preparation, I was unable to really ground my homework assignments into the research I wanted to do. Instead, the assignments were based on what had been done in the studies I used, as well as feedback from students themselves as to what they were really struggling with. Moving forward, I want to spend more time creating valuable homework assignments that have neuroscientific connections to making actual progress in one's skill set in the management of time. Additionally, I would organize less of the surveys and work to be done at home and unsupervised. Like any good habits you're trying to build, sometimes you need a helpful person to keep you motivated, and I want to be that person for my students. How did the program impact my approach? Definitely seeing things differently and problem solving. It's almost as though I look for brain function now before anything else when considering behavior concerns. If there's a problem, I ask myself, what is the cause from a brain and development perspective? Also, the concept of behavior versus the student identity. I think I had this perspective before the course, but taking the course has just really validated this for me. The behavior is so much more separate from the identity of the student. Behavior can be caused by such a number of factors, some outside of the control of the student, and as a result of what's happening in the brain, whether that be from a developmental perspective or a disability perspective. So the behavior is separate from the student's identity. And finally, it really sparked something in me. Prior to this program, I knew I was interested in this sort of intervention to try and help solve some of the challenges of anxiety and stress. Having now taken the program, it sparked such a curiosity to learn even more about my students and why their brains are doing what they are doing, and having that motivate my next steps. What did I learn through this process? Choosing the intervention, I learned through my research how stressed students perceive themselves to be and how much time management and feeling in control of your time can actually have an impact on that. Time management skills are built from a young age. They need to be taught in schools from the very beginning. High school is almost too late. While implementing the intervention, I really learned the value of my connection I create with my students. Not being there in person was just a huge struggle. I just wanted to be there to motivate, to encourage, and support. And when I couldn't be, I really saw the value in that. Also, that time is such a valuable resource. I guess we all kind of knew this, but it was really brought to my attention during this intervention. Starting this intervention earlier when there is more time to breathe into the beginning of a semester would be so wonderful and more effective. It's also made me ask the question, are we too busy? So many things got in the way of students completing the intervention that I ask myself the question, are we just asking too much of them? Which kind of overlaps into monitoring the intervention, seeing so many students how busy they are. They have so much on the go, particularly in their social lives, be it work, family, or friends. Adding on an academic load is so hard for some of them. I saw this revealed particularly in their calendars. Having students create calendars and share them with their teachers could also be a helpful tool for us to just see their workload. Students are also really hard on themselves. I didn't go much into the self-efficacy scales because it didn't impact the overall data, but what it did show is students are hardest on themselves, and I think we really need to stay mindful of that. Finally, unless this intervention is set as a priority in the teachers' and student lives, it will not get done. Simply put, unless it is made to be important by the teachers involved, the students will not see it as such. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my presentation.